This is Lecture 31, America in World War II, 1941 through 1945. Like World War I, we see similarities. The nation has to put all of our resources together. The nation has to have everybody contribute. An act of total war. So what's important about this lecture is how the war changed America. At home, and of course the lasting impact of the war. Well, the home front means Americans at home and American sacrifices. Okay, we passed the selective service. We use the selective service again for the draft, and Americans came out in large numbers. African Americans, again, like in World War I, were drafted into the military, and some volunteered in large numbers, still in segregated units. During the war, we would see the bravery and contributions of different minorities. The Tuskegee Airmen was a group of African American fighter pilots that were highly decorated, that became heroes, because a number of them were from Tuskegee, Alabama. See a picture of the Tuskegee Airmen up here. And as we know, African Americans will continue to fight for civil rights. Coming out of African American civil rights leaders, they initiated the Double V campaign. V as in for victory. The Double V campaign came from African Americans. And their goal, victory in the war and victory for more rights. They believed if they were patriotic and they contributed, this would help them get more rights at home. So a movement by African Americans to win the war and get more rights as an outcome of the war. Women in great numbers enlisted in the military. Over 250,000 women enlisted in the military in supporting roles. So they made huge contributions. One of those military operations or organizations was called the Women's Army Corps. As you can see by this poster over here. Supporting roles, whether it would be as secretary and in the medical field. Some women were involved in flying airplanes to transport goods and supplies. Even Japanese American citizens who faced a lot of discrimination participated as well. The famous 442nd Regiment Combat Team. Their slogan was "Go for Broke." Also, a group of minorities that won a number of medals and honors for their distinguished fighting in World War II. So these are all various contributions between minority and women, at least in combat. The picture to the right, this is a picture of the famous Navajo code talkers. Native Americans that use their language in creating an effective code that the Japanese could not break. Native Americans use their native language, the Navajos, to create an effective system of code that the Japanese cannot break in the Pacific. This, you see all an example of how diversity was a strength in America during World War II. We know economic mobilization is very important at war, where the government gets the economy in line with winning the war. In World War I, it was a War Industries Board. In World War II, it was a War Production Board. The government created an organization to build the weapons for war. Now, in World War II, they took a very interesting approach. Because so many men had to go and fight off in the War Production Board purposely recruited women and the women came in large numbers. The War Production Board recruited a lot of women to work in making the weapons of war, and they used the symbol of Rosie the Riveter. There she is to the right. We can do it. This is what the War Production Board used to recruit women into making weapons. And we see some of the pictures down here. Over 5 million women joined the labor force during World War II. With wartime factories, an interesting shift is also going to begin during World War II and continue after that. We're going to build more wartime factories in the southern parts of the United States, California, Arizona, Florida, and we would see this Sunbelt region grow in population. Okay, the southern part of America where they began to build more wartime factories. It attracted people to move to some of those areas in search of jobs. California, Arizona, Florida, the Sunbelt region. Also, the invention of air conditioners is going to help this demographic shift, this population shift. Similar to World War I, in World War II, we passed a War Labor Board to keep the American worker happy, to keep wages high, and to prevent any types of strikes. Because the production of goods, make no mistake, will help us win the war. One can argue that was probably the single most important factor. American production was way more than our enemies. The government also created the Office of Price Administration. This was an organization that would control prices and rents. And it went further than that. The Office of Price Administration not only controlled things like prices and rents, they put forth mandatory, this time mandatory, not like World War I, mandatory rationing on Americans to contribute, right? Limiting goods. They used coupons and certificates. People could not buy goods without coupons and certificates in order to ration the goods in America. And of course, similar to World War I, the government used propaganda, telling people you're unpatriotic if you don't participate. Look at this one. This one's particularly enjoyable. Telling people to ration gasoline, to carpool. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. The Office of Price Administration also pushed use propaganda to get Americans to buy war bonds. There's a poster here for war bonds. Deliver us from evil. Buy war bonds. And all of these were very effective in helping America raise the money to win this war. Interesting, in World War II, the federal government is going to employ and organize some of our best scientists to become involved. Science goes to war. And the example of that, the Manhattan Project, was put together in 1942. That Manhattan Project, put together in 1942, was a secret project to make the first atomic bomb in the deserts of New Mexico. It was led by Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer. He was a physicist in charge of the secret project to make the atomic bomb. They secretly did an experiment unknown to anyone, known as Trinity. There's a picture of it over here to the right. It was the first atomic bomb that they made. During World War II, we would see racial issues emerge. With, again, more African Americans moving from the South to wartime factories in the North, we would see racial conflict, like the famous Detroit race riot that took place in 1943. And other issues arose. Even as African Americans made their way to the North, they found themselves getting paid less than whites and being shut out from certain jobs because of their color. Preference always given to whites over them. Well, a civil rights leader in the 1940s that not many remember, very important, is A. Philip Randolph, and there he is to the right. A. Philip Randolph is called the father of the civil rights movement. Even before Martin Luther King Jr., you could say Martin Luther King Jr. followed his path. He was the African American civil rights leader of the 1940s, A. Philip Randolph. He is called the father of the civil rights movement. He threatened on the federal government. He threatened a march on Washington. He proposed and threatened the federal government with a huge peaceful protest, a march on Washington, as a way to get the federal government to listen to their complaints, especially when it came to economic opportunities and jobs and access to jobs. He's called the father of the civil rights movement because he was the first to propose this march on Washington. It never happened when he was a leader. As we know, Martin Luther King Jr. did a march on Washington, inspired by A. Philip Randolph. Roosevelt actually, to prevent this conflict, agreed to listen to Randolph's complaints through the Fair Employment Practices Committee. Roosevelt created the Fair Employment Practices Committee to investigate discrimination in these wartime jobs. To investigate discrimination in these wartime jobs. Now, another racial issue had to deal with Mexican Americans. Well, Mexicans and Mexican Americans. First of all, the federal government saw a need for more labor in agriculture because so many Americans were off fighting in the war. The federal government passed the Bracero program. This was a program that brought people from Mexico to work in the fields. That's what these pictures are over here. Gave them work visas, temporary stay visas. A program by the federal government to bring Mexicans over to work in the fields, to feed our nation during the war. In fact, a number of Mexican communities and families today, their descendants go back to the Bracero program. A number of Braceros stayed in America, applied for citizenship, and were granted because of their contributions. Now, staying with Mexican Americans, a terrible event took place in 1943, Los Angeles. Because Los Angeles was now full of sailors from all over America, white sailors, that were regularly visiting the downtown areas of Los Angeles and bars and nightclubs. A number of young Mexican American men known as zoot suiters, because of the way that they dressed, were also attending those same clubs, night spots, etc., and it led to a terrible racial conflict in 1943 known as a Zoot Suit Riot. Sailors roamed the streets, beating Zooters, tearing their clothes, cutting their hair. Another event that shows the racial insensitivity in America in the 1940s. And now we get to the Japanese immigrants and the Japanese Americans. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in 1942, With this executive order, Roosevelt declared the western part of the United States a war zone. Now, no, the Japanese had not attacked us in California. They never did. But in declaring the West a war zone, Roosevelt was saying that he was very cautious. He was very much afraid of the large amount of Japanese immigrants that lived in the West and what their allegiance was and whether they might be spies or commit sabotage, etc. By declaring the West a war zone, with Executive Order 9066, the federal government interned Japanese Americans. Put them in caps. With Executive Order 9066, the federal government interned Japanese Americans that lived in the western part of the United States, usually first and second generation Americans. It ended up being about 110,000 people forced into camps. Now, this is not like the camps that the Germans used against the Jews. In a sense, this was a prison for them because they couldn't leave. They were denied any constitutional rights. They lost what became millions in their livelihood, their jobs, their businesses, their farmlands, because of the fear of who they were, or the fear that they could possibly support Japan in some way. And you could see how they were discriminated against. And this was an act of discrimination. This is an act of restricting civil liberties. Well, there was a challenge to the Supreme Court, Korematsu versus the United States in 1944. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States. And the Supreme Court ruled because it was a war, the federal government had the authority to pass these restrictions. In the 1980s, Congress passed a law that gave reparations, that gave money to the survivors of the internment camps, along with an apology. Because again, it was obviously went against the constitutional rights of people who committed no crime. When it comes to military conflict, and again, this is not required in AP, but you need to remember some of the, just in general in terms of history, some of the important military events of World War II. At first in the Pacific, the Japanese were more prepared than America. The surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. They defeated us in the Philippines. And there was a terrible event in the Philippines known as the Bataan Death March that took place in 1942. They captured and they tortured American and Filipino troops in 1942. Now, America had it very difficult because we had to fight the Japanese in the Pacific, and we also had to help Russia and the British defeat Hitler in Europe. We sent forces to North Africa to take on Germany there, known as Operation Torch. We sent tanks and soldiers to take back North Africa from Germany. Germany wanted it because of its oil reserves. America and England was victorious there. That was like a stepping stone to Europe. Meanwhile, the Russians were starting to defeat Hitler and the Nazis when they made the poor mistake of trying to invade Russia. And now the Russians have them on the run. In the western part of Europe, the American commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, he would organize an Allied attack of northern France, the invasion of Normandy, would be the greatest, largest ever attack in military history. You know it as D-Day. The specific invasion was called Operation Overlord. It took place in 1944. Allied troops, mostly Americans, stormed the beaches of northern France against heavy artillery from the Germans. This was the defining moment in Europe. When the Allies won the day, won this part of the conflict, Germany was now surrounded. The Allies from the south and the west, the Russians had surrounded the Nazis from the east. The Nazis tried one last attack back, a counterattack that was called the Battle of the Bulge in 1945. American troops helped stop the last offensive. This is like the last offensive of the Nazis in 1945. And then the Allies began a massive, after winning the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies began a massive bombing campaign over Berlin, over the major German cities, as we surrounded and got closer. Adolf Hitler, as the Russians got close to his bunker in Berlin, committed suicide. The Nazi troops surrendered on May 7th, 1945. It's a picture down here at the bottom. Victory in Europe had been achieved. But for America, we still had the Pacific. Pearl Harbor was a shock. The defeat in the Philippines was terrible. The battle that would change the direction of the war would be called the Battle of Midway in 1942. It was a cluster of islands known as the Midway Islands. We met there with a lot of our Navy to take on the Japanese fleet. We see the picture over here to the right. And we crippled their Navy. We won the battle. We protected America from future invasion. The Battle of Midway changed the tide of the war in the Pacific in favor of America. The commander of the American forces in the Pacific was one General Douglas MacArthur. There's a picture of him right there. He's known for that famous pipe. After Midway, MacArthur would use a strategy of island hopping. There are many islands in the Pacific between us and Japan, and we would begin a campaign of taking island by island and sending supplies and making landing strips and fortifying those islands with more military strength, preparing for the day that we would have to invade and defeat Japan. As we got closer to Japan, two major islands off the coast of Japan we captured in 1945, and they were bloodbaths. They were especially brutal. The Japanese had become desperate. They began to use the famous kamikaze, suicide fighter pilots, against American battleships. And in most circumstances, never surrendered, tried to kill as many Americans as they could as they lost these battles. This is the famous picture of the GIs raising the flag in Iwo Jima. Towards the end of the war, there was an election in 1944, and Roosevelt would win a fourth term in office. Because we were winning the war, he won a fourth term in office. However, he would not finish his fourth term. He died from a long medical condition. And Harry Truman, his vice president, would become president in 1945. Picture of Harry Truman over here. Harry Truman would then have to make the decisions to end World War II. Truman was facing the decision in 1945. We began bombing Japan and decimating their populations, and they were not surrendering. He was faced with two both terrible choices: invade Japan, that would cost the lives of thousands and thousands of people, Japanese and American troops, or use the Manhattan Project, use an atomic bomb. Truman sent a warning to Japan with the Potsdam Conference in 1945. He warned Japan to surrender or face complete and utter destruction. He didn't say specifically we had a bomb, but it was a threat at what was going to come next. Complete and utter destruction. The decision was made in 1945. The name of the plane was the Enola Gay. The name of the bomb was Little Boy. The target, the metropolitan city of Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. The first time an atomic bomb ever used in history. The destruction was immense. 80,000 killed on impact, around 100,000 injured. Don't forget radiation poisoning that would be terrible for years to come. About 3 days later, because Japan would not surrender, we dropped the second one in Nagasaki. The strength of those bombs were too much. September 2nd, 1945, Japan surrenders. And we see the destruction of the atomic bombs. The aftermath of World War II was enormous. Massive casualties and destruction. Around 405,000 Americans died. We became aware, the American public became aware of the Holocaust and the Nazi campaign that killed 6 million people, many of them Jews. When it came to politics, now there were a lot of issues that had to be decided, and the winners, the Allies, America, Britain, Russia, and France had to make some important decisions. So this would not happen again. Politically, the big question was what would happen to Eastern Europe? What would be the fate of Eastern Europe? Because the Russians had troops in Eastern Europe as they led a campaign to invade Germany. Well, initially, when the Allies got along, in the Yalta Conference in 1945, a couple of decisions were made at the Yalta Conference in 1945. Stalin, the dictator of Russia, he promised to have free elections in Eastern Europe. This is what America and Britain always wanted, for people to choose their own government. But could Stalin be trusted, the communist dictator Stalin, could he be trusted to allow these nations to vote for their own government? I think we know the answer to that question. The other part of Yalta, Germany, and this was seen through, Germany would be divided into 4 zones. And here it is to the right. They would divide Germany and they would decide later what would become of Germany. But the other aftermath of the war, it was very clear that America and the Soviet Union, which was Russia, now a communist Russia, would become the 2 superpowers of the world. They would dictate world events following World War II. And of course, their conflict would be called the Cold War. The themes to remember for this lecture: to what extent and in what ways did World War II impact American society? Lots of categories you could talk about here. 2, specifically analyze the contributions of minorities and women during the war. 3, on the flip side of that, describe the discrimination faced by minorities during the war.